Hey, Walter Sorrells back with more tips for the knife maker. Today, how to make a knife from a kit. So knife kits are a great way of making a knife if you haven't got, a lot of equipment or space, or if you just want to kind of dip your toe into the hobby. Today, I'll show you how you can make a knife with simple hand tools that most people have in their garage. So what exactly is a kit knife? Basically, it's a knife where all the metal work has already been done. It's been ground to shape, it's been heat treated, it's probably been polished, and it may have been sharpened. So your job is to put the handle on and do all the final finishing. Today I'll be starting with this knife blank, a pair of handle scale blanks, and some pin stock. That's all I'll need in the way of material. Now you can buy knife kits like this from a wide variety of knife making supply places. I'll list some in the description and show them at the end of the video. As a general rule, although the term kit implies that you have all the parts you need, that's actually not the case generally. You'll actually have to purchase your handle scales and handle fasteners separately. But that's okay, because choosing the materials you'll use to make the handle is part of what makes these projects fun. You're customizing it, making it your way. Kit blades can be had from 30 or 40 bucks on up to quite a bit more. Scales from $5 to $50 or more if you go with super fancy material. Mosaic pins run about 10 to 30 bucks depending on size and length. As far as tools go, I'll use various files, a bench vise, a wood rasp, some simple woodworking tools like saws and hammers, and a wide range of sandpaper from 80 grit to 600 grit. The only power tool I'll use is a drill press, although you can use a hand drill if you want. There are many places in this video where you may see an opportunity to substitute a power tool like a Dremel, a bandsaw, grinder, or whatever. By all means, if it saves time and you have the tool, do it. But what I'm trying to show is how you can do this project without running out to buy a big pile of expensive equipment. So, if you're wondering where I purchased my blade, well, I didn't. I'm a professional knife maker, so I just made it myself. But, for our purposes, that doesn't matter. It's a basic drop point hunting knife design made from 440C, a very common stainless steel that's been used in the cutlery business for a long time. But what I'll show you here will apply to almost any kind of kit knife you'd like to make, from a kitchen knife to a tactical knife to an outdoor blade. Typically, knife scale blanks are sold like this. 2 blocks of wood, a quarter of an inch thick or so, an inch and a half wide, and 5 inches long. They've generally been flattened so that you can put them straight onto the blade. Now, there are a ton of ways of fastening handles to blades, including rivets, various kinds of screws, pins, and so on. We'll be using the simplest method, the pin. Pin stock's available in all sorts of varieties: brass, stainless steel, nickel, silver, as well as what I'll be using here. These are called mosaic pins. Again, I made these myself, but you can buy them from knife making supply places on the internet. They'll run you 15 bucks and up. Basically, they're just tubes that are filled with epoxy and some smaller pins or tubes. If you'd like to make them yourself, I've got a video that shows how. Obviously, your pin stock has to match the size of the holes. In this case, the holes in the tang of my blade are 1/4 inch, so I'm using 1/4 inch pin stock. As I said, I'm using mosaic pins, but if you want to use solid brass, bronze, or stainless steel rod, that'll work just fine. Alright, let's get started. The first thing to be aware of is that whatever you plan to do to the blade in the way of polishing, you need to do it before you put the handle on. If you try to polish the steel after the handle's been put on, you'll make a mess. In this case, I've got the blade where I want it in terms of polishing, so that won't be an issue. And normally you'll buy a blade pre-polished, so you don't have to worry about it either. You'll notice that the blade is polished, but the tang's ugly and still has all kinds of blemishes on it. Not a problem. We'll cover those up. As long as it's flat and there's no scale or rust on it, we're good. So, here are my handle scales. Now you can use whatever you want for the handle. Micarta, G10, bone, horn, antler, plastic, wood, carbon fiber. There's an enormous variety of materials out there. In this case, I'll be using an Australian wood called leopard wood that I sawed from my own stock of lumber. Just a note on wood choice. Nice wood is pretty cheap, so I always recommend using the most garish, over-the-top wood you can afford. I'm sort of kidding, but seriously, why use a boring piece of ash, say, when you could use something like this? Knife-making supply houses carry all kinds of really cool-looking wood, so go nuts if you can. There are also specialized wood sellers online who sell to woodworkers, bowl turners, instrument makers, and so on. Google them and find some kick-ass wood. You won't be sorry. If you're a woodworker, you may already have a pile of interesting wood to pull from. Of course, you don't have to use wood. You may be making a knife that would be more appropriate with micarta or antler or whatever. As I said, when you buy handle scales from a knife-making supply house, they'll be flattened already. That's the good news. The bad news, it's not uncommon for natural materials to warp a little. Even if they're planed flat originally, they may reach you in an imperfect state. So I'm going to start by checking the flatness of the scale. If I can see gaps underneath that light's getting through, I may need to flatten it. Same deal if it's twisted. If your scales are nice and flat, though, you can skip this next step. There are a zillion ways to flatten a piece of wood, including planing and mechanical grinding. But I'll take the least tool-intensive approach. That's how I'm going to do pretty much everything in this video. Since my wood's already flat, I'm going to just explain the principle, but I won't really show it. What you'll need to do is tape a piece of fairly rough grit sandpaper, 80 grit let's say, onto some very flat surface. Here I'm using a granite machinist's block because it's handy, but that's kind of overkill. You can also use glass, masonite, even a flat countertop in your kitchen. Now I grab it firmly in the middle and scrub it back and forth on the sandpaper. Be aware if you push down really hard, you can hollow out the wood, actually making it less flat than when you started. So, periodically change your grip and the direction you're sanding in order to even things out. A note on exotic woods. Some people have allergic reactions to certain woods, particularly oily exotics like cocobolo. Sometimes these reactions can be quite severe. So, if you don't have experience with the wood you're using, I'd recommend wearing a high-quality respirator. Okay, my flatness checks out, so the next thing I'll do is to drill the holes for the handle pins. Ideally, this should be done on a drill press, which will assure you that your holes are nice and square, but you can also do it with a hand drill if that's all you have. If you have a drill vise, clamp it there. If not, you can clamp it to the press's table. You want the blade clamped on top of the stock with plenty of room on each end, extending past the front and back ends of where your handle is going to end. That way you have room to profile everything. Also, if you have any flatness issues with your scales, it'll typically be worst at the ends of the scales, so plan on sacrificing a little on each end, front and back. Use a piece of pin stock as a locator pin. It'll go through the first hole that you drill, assuring that the second hole will be lined exactly correctly. If you have more than 2 holes, you'll want to use a locator pin on at least one more hole so they all align properly. If you're using a hand drill, clamp it in a vise or on a piece of sacrificial scrap and drill away. Next, you'll flip the whole thing over and repeat on the other side. If you use a hand drill, you'll want to use the holes you drilled in the first scale as a guide to make sure the holes are in alignment. If you drill freehand without drilling through the first scale, you may end up with holes that are drilled at slightly different angles, which will make it difficult, if not impossible, to drive your pins through the holes. With a drill press, however, this step is unnecessary because your holes are going to be at nice right angles. Next, you'll need to profile the front edge of the scale before installing it. Now, before I get started with that, I'll go ahead and cut my pin stock into two pieces. Ordinarily, mosaic pin stock is sold in lengths long enough to make several knives, so cut it as close to length as possible and you'll get more knives per piece. I like to mask off the blade with tape at this point. I'll draw the line I want with a pen. Insert two locator pins to the scales and press them firmly together. The reason for doing it like this is that we want perfect symmetry from side to side of the handle. If we just eyeball that front face, we'll end up with handles that don't really line up right. Alright, here's where you get to show personal taste. You can make that front edge dead flat, running just perpendicular to the edge, or you can round it off so as to flow with the design. Every design is going to be different, so how you do it is up to you. Normally, of course, I'd use a high-powered grinder for this, but here we'll go low-tech. I've drawn the line I want with a pen. Now I'll saw off a little extra. Then I'll use a carpenter's rasp to take off the rest of the material. Incidentally, if you don't have a rasp, these are pretty cheap. You can buy them at Home Depot or wherever, and they'll take off lots more wood than a conventional file will. Now be careful. If you go too aggressively on these corners, the rasp's little teeth will grab hold of material and split it off from the scale. Now, incidentally, it may have occurred to you that you'll want to cut out the profile of the handle on the scales to match the shape of the tang. Wait on that. The longer you wait to cut off your waste, the more screw-ups you can make without ruining things. Once I've got the line oriented the way I want it, I'll round it off. The front face of the handle scales can't be easily cleaned up later without scratching up your blade, so you want it more or less to its final level of polish now. Everything else can be done later, but this has to be fixed at this point. To that end, once I've got them rounded symmetrically, I'll go ahead and sand the faces off. I start with 80 grit sandpaper because this heavy rasp leaves deep tool marks. Then I'll move to 120 grit, then 220, then 400. Depending on what final finish you're looking for, you might even go to 600. With stabilized woods and oily exotics or really hard woods, that's a good plan. And that's what I've done here. Now you're ready to put the scales on. What you do next depends a bit on what material you're using. No matter what handle material we use, though, we're going to be using 2-part epoxy to affix it to the tang. I'm using an epoxy called Blade Bond, and some knife makers use specialty industrial epoxies like West System, but even store-bought epoxies will work pretty well. If you can find 60-minute epoxies, I'd recommend using them over the 5-minute variety, but they'll both work. First point, before gluing, test fit everything together. Sometimes your holes may be a little smaller than your pins, or things are a little bit out of alignment, and you really don't want to find that out when you're assembling everything and you've got glue everywhere and it makes a mess and you really have to kind of start over. So if you haven't trimmed your pins yet, go ahead and do that, leaving a little extra for both sides. If it's an overly tight fit, you may have to decrease the size of the pins by sanding them a little. But often just putting a tiny bevel on the end of the pin will give you enough clearance so that you can just hammer them in. But be careful, if you hammer them into a really tight hole, you can actually split the scales. So err on the side of caution. Alright, second point. Prepping the surface is by far the most important factor in whether your epoxy bond holds up. More important than what kind of epoxy you use. You want the surface of your blade completely degreased. You can do this with a solvent like lacquer thinner or acetone, or with soap and water. Whatever the case, once it's been degreased, don't touch it with your fingers. If you're using an oily wood like ebony, rosewood, or cocobolo, before you do the scuffing, you'll want to use a solvent to suck some of the oil out of the wood. Go over it a couple times as the oil tends to wick out on the first pass. This leopard wood is not oily though, so it's unnecessary here. Next, I'll scuff up the surface of the tang and the handle scales using purple Scotch-Brite. Make sure you don't get slap happy and scuff up the polished part of the blade. If you do, it's going to look awful. The purpose of scuffing things up here is to increase the surface area, giving more steel for the epoxy to grab onto. Now obviously I want fresh Scotch-Brite here that hasn't gotten anything oily on it. Once you've scuffed the surface, don't rinse it or degrease it. Just blow off the excess dust. Now you'll mix your epoxy and glue everything together. Nothing super complicated here. Glue the pins and the entire surface of the scales. Clamp the handle up. Clamp it firmly, but don't get all Arnold Schwarzenegger on it. Over clamping will squeeze out all the epoxy and actually weaken the joint. Next, clean off the squeeze out at the front of the handle scale. This is sometimes a little awkward working around the clamps, so think it through before you clamp it up. You can use a paper towel and some solvent. With all solvents, be aware of safety. Lacquer thinner's a neurotoxin, so I wear a respirator when I'm using it. One of my viewers wrote me that he uses baby wipes, which I think is a great idea, though I still haven't tried it yet. Now I'll leave the clamps as specified by the epoxy manufacturer. After 24 hours of cure time, I'm ready to profile the handle. In my shop, I do all the profiling with an industrial belt grinder, but here we'll do it all by hand. Again, I'll be using a combination of files, rasps, and sandpaper. You could also use a Surform tool or any number of other tools. Now I'll mark the outlines of the scales. Once I've marked them, I'll trim off the waste. First though, I'll use a double cut bastard file to level the pins to the wood. This way the pins don't get in the way of the various operations I'll be doing next. Normally I'd do this on my bandsaw, but I'll use a more primitive approach just to show you some other possibilities. Of course, you can use any number of tools, including scroll saws, fret saws, coping saws, Dremels, whatever. Once I've finished sawing, I'll turn to the rasp to bring the wood down so it mates perfectly with the metal. The rasp has two sides, one of which is a little bit less aggressive than the other. So usually what I'll do is use sort of the more aggressive side and then smooth it out a little bit with the other side. Just be aware that if you have a hardened steel tang, as I do here, it can wreck your files, so be mindful of blasting into the tang, especially with your rasp. I'll also be paying close attention to the grain and alignment of the wood. I don't want to chip a big old chunk out of the handle. So I'm generally working uphill, so to speak, so that I'm filing on an angle with my tool moving toward the tang. You'll see me reversing direction with the files so I can do this on both sides of the handle. Now in real life, I'd flip it over, but for the sake of the camera, I'm just doing it this way. Again, Dremels, Surforms, they're just all kinds of tools that would work here. Whatever you have and whatever you're comfortable with, use it. Once you've got a pretty clean exterior profile, you'll need to reduce the handle scales to their final thickness. Here's the challenge. You're taking metal and wood down. Woodworking tools don't like metal. You can't use a plane, for instance, or you'll just chip it to bits. But metalworking tools tend to be slow. Now, in real life, again, I just head for my 2x72 grinder. But we're going old school. The trick I'll use here is to take the pins down with a round file. Once I've got them sufficiently far below the surface of the wood, I can then turn to the rasp again. So, how thick should your handles be? Hey, that's up to you. Some people like a rounded handle, some like them more square, some like them thick, some thin. Depends on the knife and the application. In this case, I'm going to reduce each scale to a little below 1/4 of an inch. Personally, I also like a little bit of taper toward the blade, which helps you grip more easily. This is a good opportunity for you to keep trying the feel of it as you're working through it and see what's comfortable in your hand. Now I'll use sandpaper to sand the handle down. You get things nice and flat using sandpaper on masonite, granite, glass, or whatever. Or use a sanding block as I do here. Especially for your rough sanding, if you don't use some kind of hardback material for your sandpaper, you'll sand deeper into the wood because it's softer, and your pins will sort of bump up, which looks kind of bush league. And on the inside of the handle, I'll wrap my sandpaper around a piece of scrap aluminum. A wooden dowel or anything like that will accomplish the same end. Little sanding wheels on Dremels are also handy here. More or less the last step of the base sanding will be to sand all the way down from the tang to the tip along the top of the blade. This will require you to remove the tape. After everything's nice and clean, I'll switch to higher grit sandpaper and start softening all the lines and refining the surfaces. Pay special attention to the pins as they'll retain tool marks longer than the wood for obvious reasons. They're harder. When you've got everything nice and smooth with no evidence of earlier tool marks or lower grit sandpaper, you're about done. In this case, leopard wood is kind of an odd wood with some very hard fibers and some relatively soft. Bottom line though, I can get a pretty nice sheen on the wood because of the harder fibers, so I'll run on up to 600 grit. On a softer wood, there's really no need to go quite this high. Finally, I'll add a finish. There are 19 billion wood finishes in the world, all of them with advantages and disadvantages. In this case, I'll use True Oil. I'm honestly not a huge fan of the stuff, but it's actually ideally suited to a wood like this. I'll show you how I do it here, but just recognize that this is the place where personal taste is really the main arbiter. So, I'm applying the finish with a paper towel, just wiping it on. I'll apply several layers using the manufacturer's directions. Basically, you just wipe it on, let it sit and harden for a couple hours, smooth it a little with Scotch-Brite or steel wool, then repeat until you have a finish you like. Once it's fully dry, I'll buff it out. Then I'll clean everything up and sharpen it. And there we have it. Hope you had fun with this project. Here's a list of some suppliers where you can get your own kit knife. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you liked it, here are a couple of other videos that you might be interested in. Also, like me on Facebook at Walter Sorrells Blades, and check out my website, waltersorrellsblades.com, where you'll find examples of my work along with instructional videos showing all aspects of Japanese sword making, including forging and polishing, how to make hamones, and how to make fittings, scabbards, and handles for Japanese swords.